Welcome to Brew Kombucha. This is your Kombucha Basics guide to tea. So I'm gonna get started by talking a bit about what exactly tea is. A lot of people don't realize this, but tea actually comes from one plant. So whether it's green tea, black tea, oolong tea, or white tea, it's the same plant. It's the Camellia sinensis plant. And that's the type of tea that works best for kombucha making. Even though all of those teas come from the same plant, the real difference lies into the way it's processed. Some teas are dried and not fermented for a very long time, and it makes for a very mild flavor, like white tea. Some teas are dried and fermented for a very long time, like black tea, and it makes for a more robust flavor of tea. The best type of tea to use for kombucha is black tea, and it's because black tea has the most tannins present in each of the individual tea leaves. The nutrients extracted from the tea are what's going to help feed the bacteria and yeast during the kombucha fermentation process. You'll find that my recipes really only use black tea, and that's for a couple of reasons. I find that compared to white tea or oolong tea, it tends to have a more robust flavor, which I happen to really like, and it's because it also provides the most amount of nutrients for your kombucha to actually go through the fermentation cycle. More recently, I've started experimenting by adding a small amount of green tea into my black tea while it's steeping to see if that affects the flavor profile of my kombucha at all. And I found that it's actually led to a weaker tasting brew, which isn't really my favorite. So based on what I'm looking for, I really like the flavor that black tea gives my kombucha. As a general rule, I like to stick with black tea because it's the healthiest for the kombucha and because I've been able to make dozens and dozens of batches of really delicious tasting tea with that. I like to use loose leaf tea, and it's for a couple of reasons. One, I'm a really big tea drinker, and that's the type of tea that I prefer and have on hand anyway. And two, it's a lot cheaper to buy it in bulk than it is to buy a bunch of individual tea bags. For the most part, when you buy tea in tea bags at the store, the tea that's in those bags are actually a poorer quality, or they're smaller pieces of tea and not whole loose leaf bits of tea. That means that over the course of the steeping cycle, the longer you steep it, the more bitter your brew is going to get. I like to use loose leaf tea because they can withstand longer brew times better than bagged tea. And it's also more environmentally friendly because that way you're not throwing away a bunch of tea bags. When you're choosing the right tea for your kombucha, it's important to be really mindful of what ingredients are in the tea. You don't want any tea that has any essences or flavorings, even if it says it's natural flavorings or fruit flavorings, only because any other added chemicals or essences could affect the symbiosis of your SCOBY and ultimately weaken your SCOBY over time. So even black teas like Earl Grey have bergamot flavoring. And even though I've heard some rumors that there are some commercial brewing operations that actually use Earl Grey tea in their first fermentation cycle, I don't recommend it for the home brewers unless you have a lot of SCOBYs backed up on hand, only because over time, depending on your SCOBY and depending on the type of essence that they use in the tea, it could weaken your SCOBY and make it more prone to mold over time. So depending on whether you're using black tea or green tea, and depending on the quality of your tea, it really affects how long your steeping time should be when you're making your kombucha. So play around with it and see what works best for you. One thing to note is that it really is important to have a bit of a longer steeping time for your tea, longer than the amount of time you'd normally take to steep a normal cup of tea. And it's because you really want to make sure that the hot water has enough time to extract as much nutrients from the tea as possible, since your SCOBY depends on those nutrients to survive and thrive. It is worth mentioning that you can mess around with the types of tea you use during the first fermentation phase. People have successfully used yerba mate and rooibos and even hibiscus flowers to make a successful first fermentation brew. So feel free to experiment. Make sure you have some backup SCOBYs on hand just in case any of your experiments go wrong. Just keep in mind that no matter what tea you use during the first fermentation phase, the final outcome and the final taste of your tea is really more highly dependent on the flavorings you use during the second fermentation phase in the bottle. And that's when the opportunities are really way more endless than the types of tea that you're limited to during the first fermentation phase. At that point, you can really use anything to flavor it, and you don't need to worry about weakening your SCOBY over time because you're just gonna drink the bottle. If you want more information, be sure to check out the other videos on my channel, and as always, you can go to ubrewkombucha.com for more. Happy brewing!